The Right on Point podcast is a candid discussion of your legal rights, civil liberty ramifications, legalities of possible mandates of COVID vaccines, and actions by our federal government and state governments. Plus exploring the untouchable topics within the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, the PrEP Act, and the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program. Welcome to the Right on Point podcast with Wayne Rohde.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here on the Right on Point podcast. I appreciate you for joining us every week. I'm your host, Wayne Rohde. Once again, I want to announce our new sponsor for this year. It is Reform Pharma. It's an initiative out of Children's Health Defense. Listeners and viewers of this program know that most of our episodes, we talk about some in-your-face, hard-hitting, important discussions regarding corruption of our governments, lockdowns, COVID pandemic legalities, if you will, but not today. And this is why I'm really excited, because I wanted to get back to something that I like and I really enjoy talking about and thinking about and discussing, and that's more of an perspective discussion, a philosophical and of what we're doing, where we've come from. The last 4 years have been difficult for almost everyone. A little bit different degrees for everyone, but it's still it's something that we should have some discussions with, whether it's with our spouses, whether it's with our life partners, whether it's with good friends. But we need to have these discussions from time to time, so we don't get caught up in this COVID fatigue, and then we just ignore everybody. So we need to get back to doing that. And that's why I invited our next guest to come back to the program with her book. It's called Our Last Innocent Moment, and that's why I'm really excited for Dr. Julie Ponesse from Ontario, Canada, to come back to the program and talk about it. So welcome. Thank you very much for being here today.
Always. Thank you very much, Wayne. Anytime when you have a thick culture of silence like ours is, and by ours I mean North America, but in Canada even more so, we have actual hate speech legislation. And what we're about to do today would count as that, probably. It's whenever you speak out, it's an incredibly important act because it breaks through that silence and it helps to make people feel, I think, some degree of normalcy, and helps to bolster the courage we all need to keep speaking. Because my goodness, I certainly thought that the era where we weren't allowed to say what we think was behind us in human history, and that's clearly not true. So thank you.
Yes. Okay, the book, Our Last Innocent Moment, is published by Brownstone Institute. So bravo, Jeffrey Tucker and his merry band of thinkers, critical thinkers. You're a fellow at Brownstone Institute, aren't you not?
I was for 2023, so that just came to an end. So it was a 12-month duration, the fellowship, and the book was the project that I did for that fellowship. But speaking of Brownstone and Jeff Tucker, it's just an astounding. There's nothing like it on the planet right now. If you want to read, it's not so much the place to go. I mean, it does do this, but it's not so much the place to go if you want to find out data and statistics. I mean, that's all over the place. But if you want some deep thinking about where we've come from and why we're here, and reflecting from the perspectives of psychologists and philosophers and religious people, scientists, he's really, as you say, a merry band of critical thinkers. He's really gathered them, and he's incredibly good at supporting us, and there's no one like him.
Yeah, I've got a good friend that we've been communicating back and forth for the last few years on autism issues. That's Toby Rogers, and I believe he is a fellow there at Brownstone Institute. Last time I checked. So wonderful. Okay, well, let's get into it. Why did you write this book? This is a project here, so What set you down the path, and what did you want to accomplish?
Well, as we probably talked last time we interviewed about my other book, My Choice, and that was a book that was written in the fall of 2021. So that's 3 years ago now, almost, right? And that was written in response to what was happening in that moment in my life and in the world, generally speaking. And I was writing it November, December in the fall of 2021. And in September of that year, so just a month or two earlier, I was fired from my teaching position, teaching philosophy at a university in Canada, for refusing to comply with the mandates, yes, but also making my objections public and trying to open up some dialogue about whether these mandates were ethical, because that's my sort of stock and trade. I taught philosophy, ethics in particular. I have a master's degree in bioethics, and that's what I've been thinking about for many years. So when we had an actual bioethics crisis, I thought, okay, well let's use some of these skills and think through what's going on here. So it chronicled my story. It was in the moment. It was a bit of a cautionary tale. This is why I think we should be worried about these mandates. This is why I think they're unethical. This is why I think people should be allowed to question them. And this is what I think might happen if we're not allowed to do that. And lo and behold, unfortunately, most of those things came to fruition. And it was, I mean, life has been kind of it's been fight or flight for the past few years, and I hardly had a chance to pause and think about what's going on and how did we get here and what in the world happened to us to allow us to move from 2019, where everything seemed to be relatively okay. We were going about our lives, not really aware of how much surveillance was going on, how much our privacy was being invaded, how much we were being set up for this massive invasion into our lives and state control of our lives. But just pulling back a little bit and try to think, how did we get there? Persons, and then what role did we play in getting ourselves to this point?
There's a, I guess a chapter, a segment in your book that really caught my attention. The over this past weekend, when I was reading The Black Swan, White Swan, and you lead off with the following statement. This, I think, is very profound in a good way, and that is that though it may have felt like it, COVID didn't all on its own turn a previous liberal society into a cult of compliance. It merely exposed a war that's been waging against personal liberty. One, we know what happened during COVID, but what it kind of this tells me that you've been seeing this prior to COVID for quite some time. Can you explain what you're talking about with COVID being a black swan movement episode, if you will?
So the idea behind a black swan event is that it's something that is deemed to be a high impact event that's statistically improbable. So for a long time, this is an example, a philosophical example. It was believed that all swans were white. And then lo and behold, someone came across a black one and said, there's an anomaly. But it turns out that it's not that much of an anomaly because some swans are indeed black. And so COVID itself was called a black swan event for the longest time because it was thought to be anomalous. It was like this super viral disaster. Where could it possibly have come from? It was thought to be natural and this hyper sort of disaster. But when we start looking into it, and I won't go into this too much here because I know you've had a lot of guests on that explore this in more detail and we don't need to rehash it. But when you start to understand how it was set up by a triad of pharmaceutical, governmental, economic, global entities, it's not an anomaly. And it certainly isn't an anomaly when you look at some of the examples of pharmaceutical and governmental collusion in the past. So, and that's just when it comes to the collusion and the regulatory capture between the pharmaceutical companies and the FDA and the CDC, for example. It's not, I also say in the book that there's a blogger, she uses a pseudonym, Sue Dunham, and we don't actually know who she is, but she's a beautiful writer. And she says since 9/11, every threat to come down the mainstream pipe has sort of huddled us around the same consensus that some fresh element of our liberty was making us hurt and we were selfish to hold on to it. And I think in very broad philosophical terms, this classical liberal ideal that persons are free and rational and should be treated as such, and the bioethical principles of autonomy and informed consent that are meant to capture and reflect that and are supposed to be inviolable and sacred, gradually started to be transformed and marketed almost, if you will, as a kind of selfishness, that to think that we're entitled to ask questions, to make informed choices about our own healthcare was a kind of arrogance in thinking that we as individuals would know better than institutions, than collectives, than the so-called experts, which we do, by the way, because even if there is some expert who knows more about what's going on in the mitochondria of our cells, for example, that doesn't mean that person, that so-called expert, knows what it's like to experience the effects of the mitochondrial action, right? So we were, however, I think, led to believe, though, that we should not be making choices about our own healthcare. And that was happening in bioethics in very subtle ways over the last years. And when I look at it more closely, even over the last decades, and we're seeing that with the medical assistance in dying legislation in Canada in particular right now. And the language is such that if your life isn't quantifiably valuable, then maybe it isn't worth living. And maybe you shouldn't be exacting such a resource drain on the rest of society. All the language is very subtle and subliminal, of course, but this idea that persons are inviolable, this idea that we should be allowed to question, that we should be allowed to make choices, that we are free beings, the very fundamental idea of classical liberalism has been perverted by modern day woke liberals to see us just as cogs in this collectivist wheel. The only value that humans have is as sacrificial lambs of sorts for the sake of humanity's collective project overall.
One
Too
of my
much.
favorite movies, one of my favorite movies years ago, Soylent Green. Charlton Heston plays in Soylent Green, where, not to be morbid, but those who pass away are sent to a process, or those bodies are sent to a processing plant, and it creates this food product where people then consume. So it's just, as you mentioned, you're talking about I guess state-sponsored suicide, what's happening up in Canada. Here in Minnesota, we're doing the same thing, and it's going, it's morbid what's happening, and the debate of doing this, and that is that, as you said, if you can't quantify your life and whatever it is that you can contribute to society, it's not worth living, and stop sucking taking resources and just go off yourself somewhere, and the state will help you move on. I have such a great difficulty dealing with that mentality. You have I guess this wokeness of, they want to, we notice that there's a lot of youth that wants to break down the West, if you will. You're seeing that because they don't like our way of life, meaning liberty, and people being able to pursue what they want to pursue. And so you have this combined with this mentality: if you're not contributing and you want to get, move, pass on, the state will do it, whatever. It's I don't know why is it's been festering for quite some time is what I understand from you is that this has been out there and it's just COVID just put a lens on it, or is it been building prior to that and it's just getting more and more? I don't know. What I'm trying to figure out is that has this mentality been there at the same degree or strength for the last 30 years, or is it just getting more, is it gradually increasing?
But both, I think, are true. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. I hardly know where to start. First of all, I think I should
Yeah.
say the idea of the war on the West. I mean, that's Douglas Murray's territory, and he's said a lot of very, I think, useful and insightful things about that. What's really disturbing about it, as you put it, is that it's not like Bedouin charging in from the desert from the outside, although we do face that threat as well, but that our youth have somehow been transformed, and one of their primary goals is to cut out from under us the foundations that made their lives possible. So we have, I think, I mean, I taught at university for 20 years in some capacity, and every year I taught, things changed a little bit more in the classroom. When I started teaching as an ethics professor, a young female, short ethics professor, my biggest challenge was controlling the heightened debates about very controversial issues. So you'd want to raise capital punishment or abortion or euthanasia or lying or infidelity or any of these big ethical issues in class, and we have such strong opinions and such heated debates. I remember talking to professors, reading books, Googling things about how to manage that kind of volatility in the classroom. By the time I finished and getting into the 2020s and then early 2020, it was completely the opposite problem because I couldn't get anyone to say anything. I couldn't get them to voice an opinion. I couldn't get them to ask a question. I couldn't get them to do anything that suggested there were any kind of synapses firing in the brain at all. Right? And I think that the young people now see what our lives were built on, the idea of freedom and opportunity and working hard, especially the American ideals, but Canadian ideals to a certain degree as well, as selfish, as having generated the kind of problems we have now, because they see them as being intimately linked to capitalism, which they see, which the woke perspective sees as the root of all evil. And if that's your viewpoint and you want to recoil from that, then you better not work hard. You better not see yourself as an individual. You better not talk about freedom. I was just looking. Someone pointed out to me the World Health Organization has a page on misinformation, and they say you need to be, what to be on the lookout for to detect that a source might contain information. And you want to be especially on the lookout for hashtag freedom and hashtag truth. So if you come across a social media post or a website that contains freedom or truth, or the combination of those, hashtag or not, then you should be really worried about those things, because people shouldn't be talking about freedom. Because what does freedom mean essentially? Freedom means that you might depart from the norm. You might hear what the group is saying and think something different. You might hear what the group is saying and ask a question about it. It assumes the capacity not to be homogeneous with the group around us. It assumes that we're not chameleons. And young people, I think, want to be moral chameleons. They're very good, especially with their computer skills and their sensitivity to social media. They're very good at being in tune to what's being said, to the subtle ideas and the atmosphere and the collective groups around them, and extrapolating from that, towing that line so as not to offend anyone anywhere. And I don't mean to blame it all on our youth. I really think we set them up for this. I remember, I mean, my childhood was probably the first generation where we started this idea that you should give everyone a trophy, that children shouldn't fail classes or grades, that you want to be careful about pointing out the students or the children that have exceptional attributes, whether intellectual or physical or artistic or literary, whatever it is. And in some sense, you can see why we did that, because we didn't want to make people feel badly. If equality is important to you, then maybe you think that everyone should be of equal intellectual ability, equal physical ability. But when you play that out in practice, what it means is a kind of desensitizing of the human mind, because our minds are built to be purpose driven. We're built to have what Aristotle called final causes or ends in mind. We like to have goals. We like to be in the process of striving and attaining. We don't like to always fail at achieving those goals, but we like to be able to build on something, to look back on our lives and feel a sense of accomplishment, that we've come somewhere, that we're not just in a process of movement, but in a process of progress, of getting somewhere, of improving upon ourselves. And we've stolen that from our children. And at the age of 18 or 26 or 32, they don't have the skills to just recreate that when they haven't had a history of being taught how to do it.
Not to be a gotcha moment, George Floyd, was that just gas on the fire, throwing gas on the fire? Or is that an event here in the United States that just everything went south real fast after George Floyd, and that was just 20 miles from where I am, and then it sprung nationwide. But that was just at the beginning of COVID. So I'm trying to understand. There's a lot of effort being put to break down the narrative of the George Floyd, oh, he was murdered, no, it was a setup and all this stuff. And you go back and forth, but no one's actually wanting to, you got defund the police, and then the police did the right thing. And so you got back and forth, but no one's actually listening to what maybe the underbelly or whatever was there to begin with, and why did it ignite this huge firestorm? Do you have any thoughts of it? Was I guess my question is, it was George Floyd an event to where we just threw gallons of gasoline on the bonfire already, or was it's difficult to kind of comprehend and put that in perspective because it blends in with COVID. What do you think?
It's interesting. It's interesting. The fire analogy is apt, I think, because I think we're so many issues are incendiary because there's a lot lying under the surface and bubbling under the surface, and then something happens that sort of taps into our racial sensitivity, our gender sensitivity, our procreative sensitivity, our global politics sensitivity, whatever it is, and then we just kind of explode. That's one of the things that makes me think we've been on the edge of for so long. My own view is that it comes from not allowing people to speak. And when you have such a closed culture like that, and you have a George Floyd event, or you have a Ukraine event, or you have a Gaza event, um, people just they don't know how to manage their emotions or talk through their thoughts because they haven't been allowed to do it. And then you get one of these punctuated events that takes you beyond the point of eruption, and that's what we do. George Floyd event, was it part of the cause? Was it a symptom? Was it a distraction? I don't know, but I think we just have these little micro outbursts all over the planet right now. And part of it is like I said, we've not been allowed to speak. And when you're not allowed to speak, that has a direct effect. We have fMRI evidence to suggest that when you can't say certain things, when you can't utter certain words, it affects how your brain processes the concepts that are attached to those words. So, hate speech legislation is more than just keeping certain harmful concepts out of the public domain, which maybe in some sense you could argue in defense of. I don't even think you could, but maybe you could. But it actually changes our brain chemistry. And we have anger. I mean, it's not novel to say that there are anger issues all over the place, with your problems in the States, with violence in school. I have a young daughter, and so I'm often in the company of lots of young children, and I just look at them sometimes and wonder, why are you so angry? 2, 3, 5-year-olds are so angry and so revved up inside. And it's hard to know where that comes from. I think we have, uh, an unwise, heavy screen culture with distracted, exhausted parents who turn their children over to the state to educate them.
Mhm.
And we are medicating them, and we're telling them that all the things that feel natural to them, like what gender they are, and the fact that they have two parents, the fact they want to playing and not being forced into learning data and information right away. All these things I think are bombarding our children, and we're creating a culture of angry, aimless, discontented little people. And then we wonder why we get these outbursts of aggression. Even adults don't know how to converse with each other anymore. Someone posted a comment on my Twitter feed the other day to me and Jordan Peterson and someone else, I can't remember. And they said, what happened? What happened over the last 4 years that caused good old fashioned Oxford style debate to go by the wayside? And I said, it wasn't over the last 4 years. We lost that skill a long time ago. The skill that allows adults and even younger people to come together and say, I have an idea. Wayne, I think it's different from your idea. And then express some degree of curiosity about what the other person feels and why they believe that. And when you have curiosity, that's a gift to the other person that diffuses a lot of anger, because when someone asks you, why do you believe that? All of a sudden you think, oh, they're interested. Well, now I'm kind of willing to get on board with this conversational project. And that's a classical idea. That's how the Greeks and the Romans conducted themselves. That's how information was exchanged and values were communicated during the oral tradition before the written word came along. And we've decided somehow that we're better than that we don't need to talk through our ideas anymore, but that we just need to post what we think and duke it out with data and facts and fact check the evidence and trust the science and all of that. And that'll do the work for us. And it doesn't. And we're seeing the proof is in the pudding of what we've lost when we consider that those things um, are okay to give up.
Well, you got me thinking about something here, and thank you very much for doing it, because I I've been looking forward to talking with you for now, and it's educational to me, but it also, here in the States we had a couple of I think big swells, if you will, prior to COVID, and it was after 9/11. And one was when we had the Wall Street meltdown, 2008, and mortgages and people losing their homes, losing their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But there was a movement that came out of that, the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Mhm.
And for a while there, it gained, a perspective. But for some reason, I'm tying that in because a lot of people weren't able to discuss issues about why we needed to occupy Wall Street, whatever that movement was. Then I go halfway around the world and we have the Arab Spring issues. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering, because most of those people who were there in that region of the world were oppressed as far as their speech. They had no ability to address their government, to speak out. And then finally it just got to be a boiling point that just erupted over there with Arab Spring. And you're right, we need
Mhm.
to talk instead of this chatter. Hey, here's a post, here's my source, here's my link to what I'm talking about. And we've gotten away from that. And then I run across a statement, Dr. Phil. Here, I don't know if you get the Dr. Phil show up in
Yes,
Canada.
it's been really interesting to watch him sort of come into this
Right.
arena.
And he's talking about what the damages were done to our children
Mhm.
regarding COVID. And that is that, but he says it goes back further than that. And that is when I guess the popularity of smartphones came about, where people, instead of living their lives, were actually watching other people live their lives.
Mhm.
That's one of the big concerns, and he's right. That is, what
Mhm.
is that generation of kids, what they're going to be like when they're adults?
Mhm.
And
There's not only, I mean, if we're talking about the screens, it's not only the demonstrated neurophysiological effects that comes from that kind of stimulation and the two-dimensionality and the rapid change of imagery. It's not just that, and not just this sort of voyeurism of watching someone else live their lives as opposed to you understanding how to do it yourself. And no wonder we have a problem with agency and a desire for autonomy because we were never allowed, we were as children, but 20-year-olds now, 10-year-olds now, were not allowed or supported to learn how to practice being agents, which means being persons with free will and figuring out how to use that free will in more and less productive ways. But the social media especially, and I think everything that happens on the internet more generally now, tells you that your worth is constituted by whether you happen to get a positive reaction from an average group of people, right? Whether you get a certain amount of likes. And it's not something we ever had to deal with, I mean, it also, this voyeurism element, it tells you that it's normal to have access to people's highly curated lives like that. And goodness, I mean, for children now, young people now, not to realize how curated everything is that you see on Twitter or Instagram, and by curated, I mean it's false. You're editing it in the way that you would edit an essay or a piece of artwork that you've done. You're taking out the messy bits and you're presenting the the parts only that you want other people to see. And then that gives a false impression of what's possible in life and the struggles that people go through or don't go through. And it's really, I mean, Dr. Phil's talked about this. Of course, there's worries about body image, but I think it goes far deeper than that and into my area of specialty where it comes down to how you think through things and the values that people have. When you only see on Instagram pretty pictures of people's wedding, you think that a marriage is only about that. And you forget that a marriage is also about compromise and exchanging ideas and challenging each other. And there's a lot of messiness that comes from that, that is not something you'd want to take a picture of and put on social media. And so the thing, people talk to me about kids a lot, and because I have a child and I think about this a lot, two things I think are really important to recommend for people who are able to do it. No social media, no screens for the first 10 at least years of life, and as long as you could, like none. You could have a childhood without a screen, and no public education. I think that we've really done a disservice to our children by thinking that we go to all this effort to create these beautiful beings. We're entrusted with them, and then we turn them over to the state and say, you do what you want with them. And then we're surprised when we get unthinking little automatons out the other end. And our culture, I was thinking about this morning driving in the car. We have such a paradoxical sort of pronatalism in our society. So pronatalism being, the idea that we're pro-birth or pro having children. And we are, in a sense, if you're, a young woman or even a young man, and maybe you hit a certain age and people are going to start, so when are you going to have children? And everything, Instagram and Pinterest and influencers are all talking about children and the things that you can buy for children and the marketing towards children. We have a very pronatalist culture. On the other hand, as soon as you have that child, society starts asking you, oh, well, when are you going to send them to daycare? When are you going to send them to public school so you can get your life back? So I think we're a bit confused about whether or not children are valuable. And as soon as we farm them out to the care of someone else, and we don't have a say over what happens when they're being cared for, in loose terms, they're being educated, then in a sense, we can't be surprised with the product we get when they aren't the independent, confident, free-thinking people that we wanted them to be.
that connects a few dots for me there. It's incredible. Okay. About a week ago, on your Twitter, which I believe it's at Dr. Julie Ponesse.
Mhm.
You had a response to a Brownstone Institute post, and it says, "It doesn't bring me pleasure to say it, but I think we all had a hand in creating the horrors of the last 4 years. We are tragic heroes with a collective tragic flaw, and we need to come to terms with, or it will cripple us again and again."
Mhm.
What is your message there? It's not 144 words, or four short characters that were limited to whatever it is, we're limited on Twitter. That looks like that can be a chapter in a book right there. What do
It
you,
is a
what,
chapter in the book that we're
yeah,
talking
but I
about
mean,
at the moment, but also it's kind of a theme throughout the whole book. When I started writing this book, I didn't know that that was going to be the thesis of it. But I just had this inkling all along that the language that people often use, especially even in the freedom movement, or especially in the freedom movement, of passivity really bothered me. So by that I mean, you know, this horrible thing was done to us. COVID happened to us. The World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, our governments, you know, they all did this terrible thing to us as though we were going through a genocide. And in a sense, that's true. I do believe that the COVID response, that part of the COVID response has been a kind of genocide, that people have been harmed and even killed to that degree, that it's appropriate to use that term. But the language of passivity means that we weren't involved in creating it at all. And how lovely would it be if that were true in some sense? But the COVID response came about because of the power of institutions. And in bigger and smaller ways, each of us has played a role in creating, in sustaining, and in supporting those institutions. So by major institutions, I mean things like governments, big private entities like pharmaceutical companies, for example, the Institute of Medicine, the Institute of Law, the Institute of Journalism, our media. And we all support that every time we we pay for something. You know, we take free healthcare in Canada, especially. We pay for a subscription for a national newspaper. And maybe even those of us who don't agree with what's going on in the newspaper say, well, I just want to keep an eye on what's going on, or I like the comics, or you know, whatever the explanation is that we need to tell ourselves to tell ourselves it's still okay. But if we're paying for subscriptions for something whose ideology we don't agree with, then we're helping to support it. Every time we don't question what's going on with these institutions. You mentioned the 2008 financial collapse in the US, and that was not very long ago. I mean, that was 10, 15 years ago. And what that should have taught us, and I think did for a time teach us, was that be careful about big banks, be careful when they're working together too closely without us keeping an eye on them. Be careful about not questioning when the bank wants to offer you a big mortgage, which, by the way, they're doing again now. But we seem to have forgotten that lesson. And now, I mean, the majority of people during COVID just said, oh, I wouldn't question what the experts are saying. I wouldn't question what Alberta Health Services or the CDC or the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons is recommending, or the World Health Organization. It's not my place to question. They surely know what's best for me. They surely have my best interest at heart. And so every time we took that perspective, we allowed them power over our lives that's very hard to get back now, right? We say, so many of us in the freedom movement will say, we don't want the intrusion of allopathic medicine or traditional medicine into our lives anymore. We don't trust it. But we'll go to the doctor and we'll have a consult in Canada, which is free for most people. We'll take pharmaceutical products, which are often given free, or they're covered by insurance. And then back to education again, we will object like crazy to gender ideology in the schools, to teaching concepts about how there's no objective truth. But then we send our child off to school because it's free. So every time we support these institutions that end up intruding into our lives, we're doing something a little bit hypocritical. And I don't want to be all hypercritical and naysaying. For one thing, institutions have gotten the power they have because they know push comes to shove at our wallet. And they know if they offer us something free, most people will take it, right? And a lot of us, especially now with rampant inflation, Canada, we're most likely going to have a carbon tax on all of us, a 23% increase in April 1st. That was just passed. It becomes almost a luxury to take a moral stand against these things, because if you do pull your children out of public school and both parents have a job, what are you going to do? There's going to be a heavier financial burden on you. And I think the question then is, if we have figured out that we've all had a hand in creating the power of these institutions, what do we do about it? A really powerful warrior in Canada, Sarah Swain, has been talking a lot lately about radical responsibility. And I think that's exactly the right term. It's radical because we have to take control over all the facets of our lives that we previously outsourced to the institutions and the experts. That means taking control over our healthcare, our finances, where we get water and meat and milk, how we educate our children, how we provide heating for our homes, how in the world we're going to afford to put gas in the car. We have to figure all these things out for ourselves now, because we can't rely on institutions to do it anymore. And that responsibility takes probably a lot of discomfort and sacrifice. It takes a lot of research. I mean, I've just gone through the process of trying to figure out what the best water filter is for the house. And my goodness, talk about a bombardment of information. And you're not even sure if what you're reading is accurate or not, right? So it's a lot of responsibility. It's a lot of inconvenience. It would be a lot easier to be able to just trust someone else to do it and sit and watch your favorite Netflix show. But that's not the world in which we live if we want to stop this from happening ever again.
Netflix,
Just my
binging on
opinion.
Netflix episodes. Oh boy. Okay. Recent events here in the States, we had the U.S. Supreme Court hearing regarding free speech, and it was a difficult hearing. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to the audio of it, the back and forth
It's some of
between,
it.
yeah, and it's difficult. I'm fascinated with it. I listened to the entire hearing. I'm not so optimistic about it because I'm looking at some of the Supreme Court justices and the way they approach things, which is entirely different than, well, shouldn't we, our Constitution, the United States Constitution, freedom of speech, there's a reason why it's the first one in the Bill of Rights.
Everything else is built upon it, right?
Everything is built upon that. And that's not what we've seen or what we heard this past Monday, but what we've seen over the last couple years, some of the words and rulings from some of these justices. And I'm very concerned that here in the United States, we're about ready to lose our ability, the freedom of speech, with regarding our government censoring our ability to speak out. I know in Canada, it's even a little more difficult. And I'm just concerned we're heading in a direction that's very dangerous. Whereas you talked about, we can no longer control, we want to get in and determine our own pathways in regards to our own food sources. And do we buy newspapers and we buy media from, TV and whatever and healthcare? I think we're losing our ability to make those decisions. Is there a way to turn that around? How do we turn that around?
It's a big question. I'm assuming a lot or most of your viewers are Americans, or just to
I've got
on the
people in Europe and Australia listening to the
Well,
program.
let's tell everybody, and they're probably dealing with their own situation. But if I
Mhm.
go on Instagram, for example, and I come across a news story and it says something about, we just had the big issue in the Canadian House right now is a non-confidence vote led by the Conservatives against the government, which have a liberal ruling party right now. Our Prime Minister is liberal, and surprise, surprise, right? And in response to that, every single member of the Liberal, NDP, and Bloc Québécois, the other three parties, the other three major parties, ruled against the non-confidence vote. Every single member. I mean, so there's an interesting story there, right? Because if you're thinking about representative government, the purpose of representative government, and we have these parties always voting in lockstep with one another. In what sense is government really representing the people? But anyway, if I went on Instagram and I saw that there was a story about that in the non-confidence vote this week in the House, and I clicked on it, what I would get on Instagram is not the story, but I would get a notice from Instagram saying that viewers in Canada are not allowed to see this information. And that happens, I would say, more than half the time when I click on something with news content, right? Because we're being restricted that much. I mean, I never would have thought we got to this point. We would get to this point in Canada. You bring up the First Amendment, and Aaron Kheriaty, who's one of the plaintiffs in this case, who has, I've known Aaron from the beginning of this, and he's maybe the only other bioethicist on the planet who challenged the mandate and was also terminated from the University of California. But he was so eloquent because he said, if we don't challenge this violation of the First Amendment, it will be worth nothing more than the paper it's written on. The Constitution will be worth nothing more than the paper it's written on. And we certainly saw that in Canada with the emergency orders enacted during the trucker convoy. And it really seemed like no one's appeal to the Constitution mattered because we didn't have a sitting Supreme Court that cared to honor it in the way that would make it matter. So then to your question, what do we do about it? I don't think anyone listening is going to like this. But I really believe, and I think Matthias Desmet would agree with me. I think Anne Frank would agree with me. I think Rosa Parks would agree with me. I think Martin Luther and John F. Kennedy would agree with me, and Robert Kennedy Jr. would agree with me, that in a culture of silence, the only thing you can do, the thing you must do, is continue speaking out. Because together, all of those little voices, I mean, by themselves, they may not mean very much, but all those little voices, I mean, I'm just kind of getting shivers as I'm saying it. I'm thinking about it because that's how human history always works. You get an authoritarian pressure on the people, and then you get a small percentage, 2% of them grows into 6% of them, grows into 12% of them, that just decide that, as Robert Kennedy said in a recent speech, death is not the worst thing that can happen to a person, right? They just decide that this is where I'm putting my foot down in the line. This is the truth, and I'm speaking it regardless of what happens to me. We have a certain percentage of the population that's willing to do that right now. They better not cede their ground, because we will seal our fate if we do that. We need to hold our ground, and we need other people. We need more people than we currently have to get the courage to speak as well. Not necessarily publicly like I do, or some of the bigger public intellectuals do, but even in your own little corners of your world, when you're having coffee with your aunt or getting together for a play date with another mother, just saying, well, I noticed this happened this week in the news. What do you think about that? Should we think about it this way? Just asking questions, expressing curiosity. Like I said, nobody's going to want to hear this, because speaking out against the norm in a culture like ours is going to get you, it's going to make you unpopular and get you canceled pretty quickly. And there are sacrifices to that you might not endure. But if you want to know how we get out of this, that's how we do it, in my view.
There was a famous speech by Robert Kennedy Sr.
Mhm.
the ripple effect they talked
Mhm.
about. I believe he talked about when he was in Cape Town, South Africa. And I read it, and I've read it, and I've read it, and it's where basically, as what you were talking about, you take one person speaking out, and you get another person speaking out, and another. It's like little raindrops, and they create a ripple effect on water, a body of water that's been quiet and silent. Um, that's very profound what you mentioned here, is that we got to continue speaking out. I agree
And
wholeheartedly.
eventually all those little
Mhm.
raindrops hit a critical mass. And then those who have less natural courage to speak out as individuals will see that the mass has gotten big enough to provide an umbrella of safety, and they'll come under it. But we're not there yet. It still doesn't feel safe. And so those of us who have the inclination, those of us who have the value or principal priorities such that speaking out is more important than not doing so, must do so. And for people who are watching, um, I've got to say, if you're someone who just likes to sit at home and get some comfort from watching your freedom podcasts, I'm glad that it's able to offer some comfort in that respect. But if that doesn't translate into some inspiration for action outside of that context in the real world, it really doesn't mean anything at all. You know, you've got to take the ideas that we're talking about today, speaking out, protecting our children, getting those classical liberal values back into society again, figuring out this is what I often tell people: we need to figure out what we think, say what we think, and do what we say, right? And until we do those things and put our money where our mouths are, we're just going to be in this situation over and over and over again. If you believe that what's happening is wrong, if you believe we're better off to be free than be controlled, then you need to go out of the house and tell people that. You need to go to work and tell your coworkers that. You need to say those things on social media, right? And until more people do that, we're just going to be caught in this endless cycle of cynicism and complaining and fear. You know, I posted on Instagram the other day that so many people are afraid of speaking out and then losing the group to which they belong. And I said, yes, but if you do that and people react to you and you find yourself coming to a new group, that's really just a kind of alignment. And so many people have been speaking out, and I can say I've never heard one person say, I wish I didn't speak the truth. They might say, I lost my job, I lost some money, it's been a really hard period of time, my friends don't want to talk to me. They might express all these hardships they went through. But even with all of that, I've never heard one person say, yeah, I wish I kept up the facade. I wish I didn't say what I was thinking. Because I think when you speak what's true, now all of a sudden you've given yourself this great gift of integrity. And integrity is a matter of all the parts of yourself being whole. You're not lying to yourself anymore. You're not needing to have one conversation in your head and then present another set of words to the world. You're whole. Everything is true and transparent and working in concert with one another. And there are all kinds of studies to show the importance of having integrity, a moral kind of wholeness. So by that, I mean, you do what you say and you say what you believe. And there's no inconsistency between those steps. And that's, people want to know what the key to happiness and well-being and flourishing are. That's an essential step. You need to have integrity. You need to have the various parts of your consciousness work in tandem with one another. They can't be doing different things or going off in different directions. When that happens, you will have psychological stress, you'll have physical stress and symptoms, you will just be anxious all the time, you'll have negative thoughts, you'll be stressed and you don't know why. And this is what we see in society today,
Mm.
right?
Okay, in closing here, I didn't know you were gonna make it on the an apparel list when Dr. Charity was at the Supreme Court. I just put up on the screen so people can see it. A list in his blazer. I thought this was amazing. This is
Amazing. What an idea. Yeah.
big, but it really tells me something about the soul of this person, and that is in the heart. But this is him. You're the same way. You know, I mean, you do what you say, you believe what you know, in your actions, and you're content, and you're happy with what it is. And I just, it was fascinating to see the picture. And I'm looking at this list of people there, and sure enough, I see your name right there. Probably a third or fourth down on the list there of about 40 people. It was kind of fascinating. So, did you know about him doing this at all?
No, I didn't know. I didn't know until it popped up on Twitter, but what an amazing thing. And, I think, yeah, there are 40 or 50 people on that list. And the people made that list because for some reason, we hit the public radar because we spoke out early or we refused to back down or, whatever it was. But for every name on that list, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people doing the same things in their own little corners of the world. And that's what's so heartening about it. And I hope if you're listening today, you'll have some courage and confidence to keep speaking. And remember that just because you don't get a visible effect of your action right away, that doesn't mean that it's not having an effect. I think we all need to lay little seeds, and you never know which ones are going to sprout. And if you're to carry on with the gardening analogy, you want to get some flowers to bloom and you scatter 200 seeds, you're going to have more success than if you scatter two. And you never know you never know which ones are going to bloom. And of course, you have to keep watering them and you have to pull the weeds.
Right.
Um, but I
Well,
do think
oh no,
you're
go ahead. Go
talking to
ahead.
people. Well, I was just going to say you're talking to people, and you mention something once, and maybe they ignore it and they don't notice. You mentioned something. I heard the other day that someone needs to see an image 7 times if you're trying to sell them something, 7 times before they're willing to buy it. I think ideas work that way too. You have to be careful because you can just become a bit of the annoying gadfly that Socrates was, and we know what happened to him. So, but I do think there's something to be said for figuring out what you think and sticking with those ideas and not being a moving target. You got to know what you believe, and if your life is oriented toward that truth, that'll be the strongest position you can be in.
Okay. Question: do you block people out on social media?
Never.
Never.
Never. I'm not the Canadian government.
No, but people here in the States, when you put out your opinion, and then you'll get some trolls and whatever else coming after you.
Yeah.
It's quickly easy to hit block and move on. Or what I've been doing is just muting that person. It just, to me, I don't want to waste my time listening to someone that absolutely does not want to continue a civil discussion. They just want to try to get a 1 point zinger in there and then whatever. But that's tough, I guess. So you want to engage
Yeah, it
people.
is. Yeah. I mean, I guess my experience has been it always sort of works itself out. People are pretty aware of what those types are about, and they don't really listen to them anyway. But I just feel very much like in our culture of censorship and our culture of silence, I don't want to be part of the silencing. John Stuart Mill, the utilitarian who was sort of appealed to by a lot of woke, pro lockdown, pro hate speech people during the pandemic, to say we should, act collectively. Even he said, shutting down free speech is just one of the worst things you can do, because you never know what kind of idea is contained in the person that you're censoring. And I agree, it's really tough on social media because there are trolls and there are bots and all of that. But I guess for me, I just feel like it's important to make a principled stand about truth and speaking. And I think a society in which hateful things are said is always better than a society in which some things are not allowed to be said. Right or
Wow.
wrong? Ask me in a year or two, I might change my mind.
What's next for you?
What's next for me? Well, I'm considering writing another book, but I don't think I'll share details about that yet. I can say that it would be something a bit more practical than the last one. Our Last Innocent Moment is very, it draws on history and literature. It's very philosophical, psychological. And I think it needed to be that way for me in order to try to understand the broader strokes that brought humanity to this point in millennia long history. But also, I think it's important for us to figure out how to act in the moment. And so I'm working on figuring that out. I'm also working on an ethics archetype quiz for people to try to understand how they think through ethical problems. And there are different ways to do that, but maybe we'll talk about that another time.
That could be that's
Mhm.
that's deep there. I mean, I'm just thinking about that now. What you just mentioned, I'm going, wait a minute. I had a
Yeah, I'll
flashback
leave
to
you with
an old
that.
a logic class that I took in college. And so anyway, okay, we'll leave it at that. So thank you very much. We've been speaking with Dr. Julie Ponesse in her book, Our Last Innocent Moment. So you've been watching and listening to the Right on Point podcast, everyone. Thank you. It's a candid discussion of your civil liberties, issues, and your legal rights with your government. We discuss what no one else will by digging deep into injury compensation programs around the world, the corruption of government public health agencies, legalities of COVID pandemic, and what is happening in our global community. I want to thank my guest today, Dr. Julie Ponesse. I really, really appreciate you for being here. Ben Smith is my video editor. You got a lot of work to do, Ben. I've stumbled across a few terms, so he'll fix those up. And thank the many viewers and listeners of this program from all over the world. It's not just North America, but we also have Europe, Australia, South Africa, and South America. Something I leave with you every week as we talk about, and many of you know and know this, and that is keep learning, keep challenging yourself, and always question authority. Have a good day, everyone.